let's talk about passengers. So since we're talking about vehicle stops,
good one.
Let's talk about what's our authority with passengers.
Can I preamble this just a hair?
Please do.
Okay, I travel the country, and I will pose this question in class, and I will say to people, by a show of hands in here, who's been told at some junction in their career that when you stop a car, passengers can feel free to immediately depart and walk away from a traffic stop? And I'll say, and we'll get, it depends on the class. We'll get maybe a half or less than half who will raise their hand and said, I was told that, and we'll say by who. And, we figure out that it's just people who had no idea what they were talking about, just making things up and what their own personal opinion was. And then I'll provide legal documentation that contradicts that. And I'll say, well, the next time you go and you hear that, you can present this, which has happened here in Jersey. Literally, I'll tell you a quick story. Some police legal expert who's insecure, teaches this class, and this kid walks up to him and starts showing him case law on his cell phone. And he's reading through it, and he's like, where did you get this from? And the guy's like, what do you mean? He's like, is it true? He's like, well, hold on. Where'd you get this stuff from? And he goes, street cop training. He goes, oh, that guy will get you sued. I go, oh, I'll get you sued. I'm literally sending over the case law and I said to him, you can tell this guy, if you're so adamant, where are the 9 pieces of case law that negate the 9 pieces of case law I gave you regarding Brendlin v. California? And, the guy had nothing to say to it. So what I'm proud of here is our ability to challenge the status quo and say to people, hey, if you're going to say you're this, you better be this, because we have people out here who are doing the research and finding out the stuff you're saying isn't true. You have the audacity to stand in front of people and teach them about legal principles. Please be correct. And you know what? There are moments in my career where I haven't been, but I at least had the humility to say, you know what? I was wrong there. My apologies. And that's a big strength. And you'll get a lot of respect from people on that. But anyway, let's go into it. That's the preamble. Have you been told on a traffic stop, people can just depart and walk away? And we know Massachusetts and Washington, relax. Zach will address that. But go ahead with your response.
Again, I'm going to preface it with as a Fourth Amendment matter. This is going to be the answer. And I understand. I know Washington under their state constitution is different, is more protective of citizens' rights, and that's perfectly fine. And I believe Massachusetts has the same condition. But for Fourth Amendment purposes, let me step back 1 second. So normally we're taught, and I even teach the same way, there are 3 categories of officer-citizen contacts, except in New York. There's the Dubauer 4 levels, and I still don't understand the distinction between numbers 1 and 2. Kenneth Rice, hopefully you can let us know that the New York expert. But anyway, other than in New York, there are 3 categories. There's a voluntary contact, there's investigative stop, and there's an arrest. All officer-citizen contact fall in one of these categories. Well, there's a 4th one that I've started including in my teaching. It's a seizure category, and it's between voluntary contact and investigative stop. So it's a seizure, but it's not quite investigative stop, and it is the vehicle stop passenger is a 4th category of officer-citizen contact. The reason is they are clearly seized. First and foremost, all occupants on a traffic stop are seized. At least initially, okay, that's what Brendlin said. Brendlin versus California, 2007 said, when a vehicle is stopped on police authority or in response to police authority, all of the occupants are seized. Brendlin was a case where a passenger was challenging the lawfulness of the stop. So it was a case about standing, whether Brendlin had even the standing to challenge the stop, and the court said, yes, he was seized at the moment the vehicle stopped. Now, what Brendlin didn't kind of left open for debate was, well, what about through the rest of the course of the stop? Does the passenger have to stay there? And again, this is a traffic violation stop, speeding, equipment, something where the driver is the violator. So after Brendlin, that issue was cleared up in Johnson, Arizona versus Johnson. The court said clearly all passengers are seized for the duration of the traffic stop on most traffic stops. And we can talk about when they wouldn't be, but it's a real small outlier set of cases. But anyway, yeah, they're not free to leave. They're seized, but they are seized without reasonable suspicion particularized to them. This is why I categorize it as its own separate Fourth Amendment category. Because if they were seized pursuant to reasonable suspicion, which they're not passengers, what can we do? We can compel ID from them, but you can't. You cannot compel identification, meaning force the person to ID themselves.
You could always ask.
You can always ask, but when we use the term compel, we're saying we can demand their ID or they face legal repercussions if they don't provide it. Passengers are under no obligation to identify themselves unless you have at least reasonable suspicion to believe they're involved in criminal activity or some kind of violation of the law. That's Hybel, the Hybel versus Nevada. Or
6th District Court, Nevada, Humboldt City.
There you go. Thanks. Great Supreme Court case. All right. So they're seized, but they're not like fully seized with all of the authority that we have. Basically, the only authority you have with passengers is they can't leave. If you want them to stay in the car, you have the legal authority to order them to stay in the car. That's pretty much all you can do. You can ask for their ID.
What if they begin to depart from the car against your authority to hold them there? What kind of force can you use? What kind of charges can we bring against them?
So good question. So and this is going to come down to your state law, state statutory law. But we know they're seized for the duration of the stop. So that carries with it the authority, the implied authority on my part to use a reasonable degree of force to keep them there. So if he tries to walk away, I can use a reasonable amount of force to keep him detained if that's what I want, if I want him to stay. Or I could just say, well, have a nice day and be on your way. But if I want him to stay, I can use a reasonable degree of force to do that. Now, whether that act of trying to leave the stop without permission and me having to use force and maybe they put up a little bit of resistance, whether that amounts to a crime is going to depend on your state law. In Virginia, I can tell you from personal knowledge that act by itself is probably not going to rise to an obstruction of justice. It's certainly not resisting arrest because I don't have probable cause to arrest them for anything.
Until they resist.
Until I have probable cause to arrest them for something, and then they continue to resist. So what can I do? I can forcibly put them back in the car and continue with whatever it was that I was doing. So some states, I would imagine most states probably have some kind of statute you could charge them with, but it's going to depend on that.
Yeah. When you say forcibly put them in the car, I mean, in my mind, I'm trying to paint a picture for the people who are listening. You know, as long as they're not resisting and pushing back at you, because then you have an officer assault, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, you got to, you could touch them. Hey, listen, you got to sit back in the car, point back in the car. They get back in and there's no charge, but you can tell them.
Talking about using minimus level of force where we're maybe just kind of physically guiding them back in the car. Or maybe we could in the back of our car, perhaps.
And the guy starts to push past you or the girl starts to push past you. Now we're at a point where we're getting into an officer assault and an obstruction by means of physical force.
Absolutely. And then every state has an assault battery statute that could apply. It depends on the response of the subject. Yes.
Right.
But no, they are not free to leave on their own. They have to stay for the duration of the stop.
And you would say a far majority of states adopt this ruling. I can agree with that.
Well, yeah, they're the only two that I've ever seen. Well, I know Washington, and I certainly take your word that Massachusetts is one. I haven't done a whole lot of research on Massachusetts.
It is.
I'm not surprised that that's one of the states.
It's nuts. I read their case law and I'm like, I start class and I'm like, yeah, you're all fucked. But you're not. They still listen, man. And it's crazy because on the surface level, it's interesting. It's like New Jersey. As liberal as New Jersey is in politics and democratic state, you would be hard pressed to find a conversation where people are very liberal. A lot of that's guided by, I guess, certain areas in New Jersey. But overall, people that it's a very conservative state. You'd be surprised. And the same thing with the state of Massachusetts. It's a conservative state, like the Boston PD. We have a new instructor, Tommy Brooks. He's got a class coming out called The Gun Game. He's a killer. He's a sergeant in Boston, and he's like, dude, people like us here. Like, they don't give us a hard time. Like, there's a lot of respect for the law enforcement in Boston. It's a very interesting thing. And then you go to their courts, and it's extremely liberal. And that's Virginia's the same way. Outside of your metropolitan areas, Virginia's a very conservative state as well. The reason for passengers being, why the court says they're seized is it's safety. It really just boils down to officer safety. It's not. That's where Mims and Wilson come from, ordering people out of the car. If the court recognizes the inherent danger officers face on traffic stops, as the danger associated that passengers are associated with. The court defers when an officer determines a particular course of action would be safer on a traffic stop. Courts are very, very inclined to defer to the officer's judgment, and that's the basis for these cases. When you start.